were wrong about these. I'm sorry. Some of the recommendations they made, we were doing what they said. So do I just say,
Actually,
isn't that
some of the points that we didn't go over will be good fodder
I
for.
think you should say,
is it
we
like
just disagree.
we have acquisition,
We have acquisition
and we
experts
are
working
doing what
on
we're supposed to do, and we responded. We have.
And we have
She
a-
said we didn't have a. She said we didn't have the right plan.
personally? And what lessons has the company taken from the events leading to today's hearings? And how will you change Toyota in the future to protect people and to provide an excellent product?
You want to answer? You may answer, Mr. Nabo or Mr. Toyota. What have you learned, etc.？
こういう例えばリコールに関してございますが、今まではあまりにも技術的見地、そしてかつ、法令遵守をしているかどうか、その2点に非常に集中してやってまいりました。今回いろいろ話していただいたことの一番大事なことは、セーフティーカスタマーファーストで、セーフティーに対しては、前も今も非常に重要視してきたことには変わりございませんが、そこにお客様視点というものを入れることということがまず第一点。そしてもう一点は、よりタイムリーに地域の情報を得て、それをできるだけグローバル本社に時間差がないような形に今後努力をしていきたいというふうに思っております。
With respect to the recall, thus far we have been too much focused on two perspectives. One is technical perspective, and the other is compliance with laws and regulations. The most important lesson that I learned from this experience relates to the following. With respect to customer first philosophy, we have been placing the highest priority on the safety thus far, and we will continue doing so. But on top of that, from the perspective of customer first, we will place greater emphasis upon customers' viewpoint and perspectives. So that's the first lesson that I would like to mention here. And in addition to that, we will make sure that we get information from various regions of the world in a more timely manner, so that the time lag be minimized between different parts of the world and the global head office in Japan. We will make efforts in that direction.
Thank you. If I may say so, the reason that you have seen such emphasis of what you call the technical matters and the law is precisely that customers did in fact apparently over and over again complain about these issues, but had no way to know the cause and expected Toyota to in fact look at the technical details. The technical details are beyond a family that reports unintended acceleration. And the family expects that having reported that, there will be an immediate remedy. The matter of law goes to transparency itself. The law requires automobile operators in this country to, manufacturers in this country to operate in a certain way. And therefore, the first thing we do is the law can see if they are operating according to law. And law here meant, of course, the regulatory agency. I don't know if you want to respond, but I do want to make it clear. And I was pleased to hear that apparently the route from customer complaints to those who can do something about it is one of the reforms you have suggested in your testimony already. And apparently these went astray because they didn't get quite straight up to the fix-it person. And as I understand it, one of the most important reforms is not the customer complaints you'll listen to, I suppose you heard them, but the right people in the structure did not hear these complaints. Is that so? At the right level, the level to bring an immediate remedy, those people didn't hear it soon enough, and so the customers weren't heard soon enough. Is that correct?
全く聞いていなかったわけではないというふうに思っております。要は、その
does not lie with the customers. You can bet your bottom dollar that the first time there was unintended acceleration, that's about everybody's horror. You can bet your bottom dollar that that customer reported that. Your answer, which goes to we'll see if this is duplicated, is in some ways very troublesome. Because that is such a serious problem that once it is reported one time, it seems to me you have got a huge problem on your hands, and you seem to be saying, well, if we hear it enough, then we'll know we ought to do something about it. That's very troublesome.
Well, what we said in our testimony and other many other times, customer first is the thing that we have been doing, but we have to make more focus on the customer concerns and complaints. And for that matter, I think we also work closer in TSA, NHTSA, so that when they receive the customer complaints, we like to know more about it, and then also some of the information has been will be sort of open to us, including VIN number, so that we can trace back each one of the customers. As I said, the SWAT team. So we are trying very hard to really put the word customer first.
First, let me say to you, I'm going to ask you a question that I think every American who has a Toyota would want me to ask. And I can ask this because it's personal as well as congressional. I drive a Camry hybrid. I switched to Toyota very reluctantly because I wanted to buy an American car. And the Americans were not making hybrids almost at all, or were so few that I went straight away to Toyota. Why? I didn't ask how much it cost. I was relying on this extraordinary reputation for quality and safety that had been built over generations. So I ask you, Mr. Toyota, is there any chance that the Camry hybrid will be recalled for any reason?
So let me step in. First of all, Chairwoman, you are driving American car. It is produced American.
It's got
produced here, supplied here, and then so that's all
Yeah,
I want.
many Toyotas are produced here and supplied here, aren't they? We're pleased to have you produced and supplied here.
Produced is
But
not
the worldwide reputation begins in Japan and stands behind wherever they're produced. Sometimes they're produced in Europe.
very true.
Um, Mr. Toyota, I was impressed with your opening remarks. In fact, I'm impressed with your being here, and I'm impressed with some of what you have said you intend to do, because we are really going forward. I am trying, in my own questions, to get some sense of where we need to have confidence in Toyota and where there's still some questions. But in your testimony, you say, and I'm quoting, I would like to point out here, this is page 1 of your testimony, that Toyota's priority has traditionally been the following. First, safety. Second, quality. And third, volume. I'm going to ask you a question about what seems to be a fourth priority. That is, for me, the most troubling aspect of this controversy. And that fourth quality is secrecy. To get to the heart of my concern about secrecy and the culture of secrecy, I would go to the data recorder, otherwise known as black box. Now, people in the United States are very familiar with airline black boxes because they know that in that black box is critical information. And if you get to it fast, you can find the cause. You can not only respond to those who have been hurt, you can put to rest some of the concerns as people begin to speculate what indeed caused this, and they come up with sometimes wild conclusions. But that black box is critical. Now, other manufacturers understand just how important it is to get to the cause of the accident for all concerned. Make the black box data available to download. I have had a hard time understanding, therefore, given the fact that your competitors make this data downloadable easily, I have had difficulty understanding Toyota invoking proprietary technology that allows only you, Toyota, on the spot to download. Why should we respect your proprietary technology any more than we respect the proprietary technology of other automakers, particularly given the safety aspects of this matter and the fact that an accident has already occurred? Why do you not want to clear the air as quickly as possible? On what basis do you invoke some proprietary technology interest when your competitors do not in the downloading area?
Let me respond to that question first. That yes, we know that Detroit Free manufacturers have this information, and then the reader is commercially available. Toyota is also making this.
Wait a minute. What's commercially available and when?
Detroit Free, General Motors, Ford, Chrysler have this commercially available reader that this what you
Why
call
don't you have such a reader?
we are in a process of making it available, commercially available by probably middle of next year, which is ahead of the law requirement. A. B. That this year by April, in 2 months' time, in less than 2 months' time, we are going to make 100 million available at any region, any area. The point is that, with the authority, also in the past request, we made it always open. Now, this is the information, the EDR information is the owner's information that with their consent, we can make that information.
Yeah, it was available if you were on the spot. I mean, we don't
No,
understand
we
what.
will not hide it at the request of authorities, like police request, or NHTSA request, or some other government authorities request. We have made it open.
Once you came as if there was something that was so secret that even you had to be there in order for law enforcement and regulators to read it. I just don't understand the difference. Indeed, let me make sure I understand what your testimony is. Are you saying that the company is redesigning the black box so that it can be readable by law enforcement, by safety investigators, and consumers?
And owners of that. It is
Consumer,
not,
yes.
it should not be made available to anybody else unless there is a consent, to my knowledge, of the owners of the vehicle.
You would not have to be, Toyota would not have to be present in order for the black box to be read. Is that true? Just like other manufacturers, you don't have to come to unlock the black box personally.
I don't know that technical detail to answer.
Well, that's the whole point, sir. 1 second. Mr. Chavez from Utah, you have 5 minutes.
Mr. Toyota, thank you for being here. Very much appreciated. Mr. Toyota, do you believe you're being treated the same as other manufacturers in the United States and Canada?
Yes, I believe so.
Do you have any reason to believe that other automakers are treated any differently by NHTSA?
No, I don't think so.
Maybe you can hand the document, please, to them. There's a document dated July 6th, 2009. If you could take a look at this, please. This is an internal Toyota document dated July 6th, 2009.
Sure.
Mr. Nava.
That was very kind of you. I appreciate it. Sorry about that.
Thank you all for your patience, forbearance. Mr. Turner, you had wanted an opportunity to give a brief opening statement, and now might be a good time for that, if you would.
Massive government support for Detroit automakers. Is that concerning? Why was that brought up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for your continued focus and effort here, and I also want to thank Jane Harmon for her career-long focus on this. That we've been I've had the fortune to work with Jane on a number of issues. As some of you know, my initial interest in this came about by the unfortunate murder of Maria Lauterbach, who was from my community. That brought to light several issues as to how rapes are handled both in the report and with the victim. So I have worked with a number of members on issues where we've tried to find ways to change both laws and to work with DoD on ways that we can enhance the protection to victims and also find ways to provide them additional support. This report, I think, is an excellent report for a basis to begin the process of looking at additional ways that we can support victims. And I want to focus on one aspect of an item that I know is important to all of you, and that is the issue of culture. Almost in every sexual assault hearing that I go to, I read this provision of an answer that I got as a response to questions that I had submitted concerning Maria Lauterbach. General Kramlich of the U.S. Marine Corps was responding to a series of questions that I had posed with respect to the Maria Lauterbach case, and a number of statements that were made through DOD and through the Marines that I found troubling. One of those was that they had indicated that they had no notice that Maria Lauterbach might be at risk because there had been no violence that had been alleged in the allegations of what had occurred to her. So I wrote the question of, doesn't a rape accusation inherently contain an element of force or threat? And the answer that I got back was in May 2007, when Lauterbach formally made allegations of rape against Lorien. The command was only made aware of 2 reported sexual encounters, one sexual encounter characterized as consensual by Lauterbach and the other alleged to be rape. Lauterbach never alleged any violence or threat of violence in either sexual encounter. Now, the reason why I read that in every hearing, because when we have the issue of culture, I would hope that throughout DOD no one would ever write again that any sexual assault could not have an allegation of violence or threat of violence, because as we all know, it's inherent in a sexual assault itself. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for bringing the highlight to this, and know that we all have a lot of work to do, and we appreciate the work that you all are undertaking. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll begin the questioning if nobody has any objection to that. Dr. Whitley, back in August of 2008, we had a report from the General Accountability Office which made 9 recommendations to improve the Department's sexual assault prevention and response programs. Today's report from the GAO states that you've implemented only 4 of those recommendations, and 2 of those 4 were actually addressed by non-SAPRO task forces. So can you explain to us why some 18 months later, since that report comes out, such a small percentage of those 9 remaining objectives have been dealt with effectively?
We may have actually addressed more since then. I could probably answer the question better if we talk specific recommendations. I know one thing that was of particular interest to you, sir, was the oversight framework and the strategic plan. We have completed that. As I did take it per your suggestion to Ms. Farrell and give her a briefing on it. They made suggestions. I went back and took their edits and their suggestions. And that has been completed, and we've already begun some implementation. We're still waiting for it to be signed out by the new undersecretary.
Well, Ms. Farrell, of the 5 that were unaddressed at all, your recommendations, can you prioritize those for us?
Certainly. I would like to focus on the oversight plan, and we do appreciate the cooperation that we received from DOD by sharing the draft framework with us during our review, so that we could see it and analyze it and comment on it. And they should be given credit for laying a foundation for their oversight framework, which is quite a challenge. But that oversight framework, strategic plan, whatever you want to call it, based on our body of work, looking at best practices of successful organizations that are results-oriented, there are identifiable key elements that you'd want to see in the oversight framework, which we noted in the August 2008 report. At a minimum, you want clear goals, objectives, milestones, and performance measures. And performance measures are very key for that roadmap. As I mentioned in the opening, performance measures are necessary to gauge where you are as you're headed toward your goal, and to measure and make a course direct change if necessary. And that is one of the key elements that's missing in that oversight framework is the performance measurements. Another that we discussed with DOD back in November before we sent the draft report over with the recommendations that we'd like to see is once you have the performance measures, you need strategies of what you're going to do with the results once you get them in order to make those course corrections. Another element we'd like to see is tying the program objectives with budget priorities. Very key, because that will help DOD to support justification for any resources that they need, whether it's personnel or funding. And lastly, there were 3 documents that DOD provided to us during the review, and sometimes you'll have one comprehensive strategic plan, sometimes there's multiple documents. That's fine. We do not take issue with how many documents they have that comprise their strategic framework. But the 3 documents provided to us were difficult to tell how they did complement each other. Two of the documents had 5 objectives that did match up. But then the oversight framework that they discussed with us and provided with us that was responding to our recommendation had 9 improvement initiatives that we could not correlate back. So it's not clear to us what that oversight framework that they provided to us, where that fit with the other documents that comprise their strategic planning.
Dr. Whitley, is that helpful? Is that something you can work with Ms. Farrell and sort of correct?
Absolutely. We did take the plan back after my meeting with her, and we developed a user guide. We also have requirements in the department to have a strategic plan, and it would be confusing to someone looking at the 3 documents. We have to align ours with the personnel and readiness plan and the secretary's plan, and we also had to go back and refit all of that. Then the oversight framework, we saw that as we hung that, if you will, on our strategic plan and saw that as part of our oversight. We see our role as prevention, victim care and response, and then our role as system accountability, and that's where we hung the framework. I think now we've made it more user-friendly, and we've also developed measures. One of the things that we talked about at the last hearing, our civilian and federal partners all struggle with finding the best measures for sexual assault, because as you know, you can't use reports because it's so underreported. So we are looking at ways now to measure prevention and response, and we were able to get at least 4 or 5 measures in the PNR strat plan. And we're going to measure awareness, we're going to measure victim satisfaction, and we are developing surveys. And it's a challenge, and there are not very many models out there.
Okay. I mean, it seems to me that you have a good working relationship with GAO, and I appreciate that, and so I'm trusting that you'll be able to continue that and resolve those issues. I think they provide value added to you and a resource for you, so I appreciate that you are working with them and being open about it, and we'll expect that those things will be resolved. Ms. McGinn, just before my time is up, how are you aligning the resources, the money, to this so people know that you were serious about it and that it's going to get funded appropriately? And 2, the General made a good point. Are you going to be able at the Department of Defense to undertake a review of the Guard and Reserves at the state and unit level?
We have just recently, I think it was last year, established program element codes. And into those program element codes, the military services put their money that they have dedicated to this program so that we have visibility over it. And that we can see that it's in there and it's not being cut or it's growing or whatever. And I think in FY10 there's about $110 million so far that the services had identified. In addition to that, we have succeeded in getting additional funding for the Sexual Assault Prevention and Response Office, $20 million to help with our outreach efforts, our oversight efforts with the development of the database and those kinds of things. So we're watching the money, and 2, we're actively engaging in the budget process to try to find more money where necessary for it. And we absolutely believe we need to look harder at the Guard and Reserve. And we're looking at ways that we might do that. We do have a Yellow Ribbon program, as you know, that works with the Guard and Reserve, and we are involving the Guard and Reserve in our various oversight committees. So we agree with that recommendation. We'll take action on that.
Mr. Flake.
Thank you. Brigadier General Dunbar, you mentioned in your testimony that things were improving, and I just wasn't quite clear as to if you're referring to fewer incidents of abuse, and how would that be measured, or the plan being implemented, that is improving in speed, or can you qualify that statement? And maybe I heard it wrong, but you mentioned something like that.
In terms of improving, what I'm referring to is that the program focus, certainly within the services, the leadership attention that is being given to it from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to the service secretaries and the service chiefs, down to, in some locations, not universally all locations, unit commander involvement in addressing the issue. From the SAPRO standpoint, I think, since 2005, establishing restricted reporting, which, I think a lot of commanders were very reluctant to embrace. Now many people are seeing that as very good because more victims are coming forward, those victims who wouldn't have come forward had they not had that restricted reporting option. And so I think awareness is growing and appreciation for a lot of the mechanisms, thanks to Congress's oversight and thanks to just the continued emphasis. We are having folks come on board. People are accepting the fact that sexual assault does occur within the military services and it needs to be addressed. So from a program standpoint, response has increased, even in the prevention area, which we were initially finding lacking. The fact that the DoD SAPRO office is really working the bystander intervention, all the services are addressing that. That is positive progress. But at the same time, one of the concerns that we have is that bystander intervention is not the be-all, end-all in terms of a comprehensive prevention strategy, and that more needs to be done. So progress, but still more to be done.
Can somebody tell me, over the past, say, 2 years, has the reported cases of sexual abuse gone up or down?
We've had approximately 3,000 reports each year, and we will be releasing our FY09 report on 15 March, and we already know the numbers have gone up slightly. We hope, we want people to report. That's our goal in the department.
That's I guess my next question is, certainly the recommendations include, increased awareness and education, and with that comes in reporting requirements, or not requirements, but structures that people are more comfortable with. Are there recognizing that part of improvement is getting more people to come forward? Are there metrics then to gauge whether we're improving or not in terms of incidents of sexual abuse, independent of how many are reported?
We're developing a survey with the Defense Manpower Data Center to ask people on a survey if they've experienced unwanted sexual contact and if they've reported. One statistic I do have, since we've had restricted reporting, it was the middle of June 2005, we've had over 2,600 people use the restricted option reporting. So that is data that tells me that that's something that we should continue, and that is a good option for us in reducing barriers to reporting. And we are working on other ways to measure the prevalence of sexual assault. Even in society, statistics show us that less than 18 to 20%, only about 18 to 20% of victims report to an authority, so it's vastly underreported. So what we're doing in our program is we're trying to remove the barriers that keep people from coming forward, and to try to build climates of confidence and to reduce stigma. And stigma is also a big, we want to reduce stigma for any type of mental health that people are seeking.
Thank you.
Mr. Turner, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. After you all testify, there'll be a gentleman who's testifying, whose name is Merle Wilberding, who's an attorney who has worked with the Lauterbach family and has worked with my office on some of the legislation that we've sponsored on issues such as military protective orders, ensuring that they don't expire, and also that so local jurisdictions are notified, because actually in her case, the local jurisdiction did not know that a military protective order had been put in place, and we changed that in legislation with the National Defense Authorization Act. In addition to representing them, I just want to give you one fact about his legal career. As an Army JAG captain, he was assigned the responsibility to represent the government in the Lieutenant Calley appeal of his conviction in the infamous My Lai massacre. So he has a little bit of information on the inside, in addition to representing this family. And in his testimony, one of the things he's going to highlight is the issue of the victim advocates, and he's going to lay out the case of really how people feel, whether or not that system is responsive. And then he has a recommendation that perhaps victim advocates need to establish a line of authority outside the base chain of command. I wondered if you all might comment on that, having looked at the issue through your task force. That's not something that you've recommended, but it would be interested to get your thoughts on that. General Dunbar, why don't we start with you?
Congressman Turner, one of the things that we did recommend was to provide some confidentiality with the victim advocates, because in the statistics that we saw, approximately 78% of attorneys who were prosecuting cases had indicated that they would, or in the defense would, subpoena victim advocate records. And so When you know that you have victims who we tell to go to a victim advocate to seek the care, and yet at the same time know that they're vulnerable to having whatever they disclose be used against them, that is not what we would consider to be providing adequate victim support. We do think that you can establish a system that allows the victim advocates to have that confidentiality and still have them within the military structure, as opposed to going outside of a military reporting chain. So, in answer to your question, we did not explore specifically the proposal that you have outlined, but we recognize the importance of victim advocates and the care that they provide, and realize that we have a deficiency as it currently is set up.
Do you have an opinion on that issue, on his recommendation?
Well, sir, as I said, I do believe that we can cure the issue without having to have the victim advocates report outside the chain of command. There are a variety of options, I think, that exist.
Anyone else wish to comment on the issue of the chain of command?
If I could.
Yes.
I think we want commanders to be involved and to be proactive and to be advocates and to help solve these problems. And I think there could be a little bit of danger taking this outside the chain of command, that you would create a space where the commander wouldn't know what was going on, would not be involved, and would set up a almost a conflicting relationship. So I would just caution that I think we want commanders, as I said, to be involved in this process and to understand their responsibilities and to respond correctly. So.
If I could just add, I think, the issue, and especially in our review as we looked at restricted reporting, we have found that the commanders, if they know that certain restrictions exist, they respect those restrictions. And so whether it is within the chain of command, if a victim advocate is granted confidentiality, I think a commander would jeopardize his or her position by trying to pry information out of the victim advocate. And so that's principally why I think that we have options that we can work within.
If I may weigh in on this too, we found one of the issues, access to a commander is critical for the health of the program. And so with the sexual assault response coordinators, when they had that access with their commanders and were able to voice their concerns and bring issues before them, we felt that they were very successful in what they were trying to do. When they had 2 or 3 levels of bureaucracy that they had to deal with, their effectiveness as response coordinators was significantly diminished. That's why the use of contractors as sexual assault response coordinators was one of our recommendations. We think that access is critical, and we think it's not only important to the program, but as many people have mentioned, the commander sets the tone, and the commander really needs to know what's going on in his or her command.
Well, and with the chairman's indulgence, the reason why I find it an important recommendation is because, in the military, the situation is so unique in that the individual who is the victim has, the military in effect has a custodial relationship with them where they can't get up and leave. They're told where they're to be. You don't have the same freedom of movement that you would have if you were a victim in the private sector. And then to have what is ultimately up the chain of command, your boss, having the same people reporting to you that are supposed to be aiding you, the inherent conflicts of interest are just obvious as to how they could arise. And so I do think it's something for us to have more discussion on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Harmon, we want to welcome you to the subcommittee and thank you for your interest in this subject and your leadership on it, and welcome you to give us 5 minutes of questioning, if you would.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the fact that this subcommittee on a bipartisan basis has held 4 hearings on this subject. There is intense concern from Congress about what I would call an epidemic of assault and rape in the military, which I view as both a moral problem and a force protection problem. And at a time when the public looks at Congress and thinks we can't do anything together, I hope everyone was listening up. I think both sides of the aisle on this committee are equally concerned, and I know, Mike, that the Lauterbach family is very lucky to have you as their representative. You have been passionate about this issue, which is something we all need to be. On that point, only one of you, and that was Dr. Whitley, mentioned in personal terms the toll that rape and assault takes on people. Dr. Whitley said it changes a human being's life forever. and it may terminate some human beings' lives in the case of Maria Lauterbach. So I think we have to keep that in mind. It's not just a question of statistics and strategies and milestones and goals. This is a deeply personal issue. It's a violation of one's physical space. And as I guess the only woman member sitting up here, I want to say how strongly I feel about this and how urgently we have to fix this. And I guess my message and my questions today are focused on prevention. It's good to, you've all heard me say this in the past, it's good to be better at response and better at victim care. I applaud you for trying to do that, and it's good to coordinate the statistics and create a more comfort for victims to come forward. All of that's important, but wouldn't it be better if we didn't have victims? I mean, let's get a sense of the proportion of this. I in August 2007, went to the West Los Angeles VA, where there is a women's clinic, and I was blown away to hear that 41% of the female veterans they see are victims of military sexual trauma, and 29% were raped. Now, this isn't a scientific survey, but I'm sure those are accurate figures for 3 years ago in the West LA VA. And generalizing this to the country gets me to my little soundbite, which is a woman is more likely to be raped in the military than killed by a fellow soldier than killed by enemy fire. So my question to you is, shouldn't we be doing more about prevention? I welcome your response, each of you. And specifically, shouldn't we be doing more of what the Army is doing with its I Am Strong campaign by hiring outside investigators and prosecutors to teach a team of 300, I understand, prosecutors in the Army to do a better job of investigating and prosecuting these rapes and assaults, so it sends a strong message to people that you cross a red line, and either as a perpetrator or as someone in the chain of command, and you pay a big penalty. Ms. Farrell?
Thank you. I would like to note regarding that first part, our report does note that not only does sexual assault have implications for the individual, but for the family, the friends, the colleagues, the whole community, besides the unique impact, obviously, on the military that we were discussing earlier. Regarding prevention, shouldn't that be important? I believe all three legs.
Shouldn't it be more important, more emphasized?
It should be, it is a prevention, response, and resolution. So I think there has to be emphasis on all three. As you know, after SAPRO was developed and established, rather, the emphasis was really more on response. Taking care of the victims was driving. And it's just, I think, in the last year, and of course DOD can speak to this more, where they've gotten more of a handle on the prevention. And that's what we're looking for, again, in the strategy of what are the clear goals of what you're trying to accomplish. And by having a very clear goal on prevention and how you're going to get there, maybe we will see this, actually, the numbers go down.
Mr. Chairman, could others just answer my question? I know my time is expiring.
Thank you always for the support you've given this program, Ms. Harmon. One of the things, I know the Army came out with their I Am Strong campaign, and the department has a DOD-wide strategy. We work very closely with the Center for Disease Control and use their spectrum of prevention, which tells us you have to work the strategy at every level, from the individual all the way up to policies and laws. And we also work with the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. And each of the services, in fact, the Navy and the Air Force each held summits just a few months ago. They brought in their highest levels of leadership. And I can tell you, in talking with some of the generals that were there and the leaders, they are all on board. And I think we have a very strong prevention campaign and strategy in all of the services now.
If I could add, I had noted that there needs to be a greater emphasis on prevention, and having the strategy is great. The bystander intervention is one facet of it, but it also includes the community awareness and physical safety. For instance, when we were over in the AOR, how you actually set up a location, where you put the female latrine, where you site the female tents. Sometimes we have the cultural issues of this is the way it's always been done before. Likewise, even when you are going through the dormitory or the barracks areas, basic security measures, and some of the newer facilities you find that you've got the video cameras, surveillance cameras that are set up. It is a lot of it is driven by culture, and the more awareness that we have in addressing the issues, the greater you can provide prevention at basic levels. And that the key to all this is leadership involvement. The senior leadership of the services, no doubt, are all engaged. As I mentioned, the chairman is engaged. But that needs to populate down to unit commanders who have to understand that they have to be out front addressing this issue on a regular basis and have candid discussions of the fact that sexual assault is not tolerated. And even those things on a continuum to include sexual harassment, that those behaviors are not going to be accepted within service in the armed forces.
Could I just add one thing about culture? Because the military culture is created, and we take young people off the streets of America and we send them to basic training and we turn them into soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. And while it's a more long-term solution, if we look to what we already know in terms of how to create soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, couldn't we also look to how we change attitudes and how we inculcate this as a cultural issue? And I would just like to note, I was reviewing service programs in preparation for this, and I was struck by the fact that the Army, for their new recruits, has now got, the new recruits receive sexual assault training during their reception, during the first week of basic training, just prior to their first overnight pass, and upon advanced individual training entrance. So that kind of emphasis, I think, at the basic training level, I think would go a long way for us.
Thank you.
If I may, you have highlighted what was for us as a task force one of the most critical recommendations, that we have a comprehensive prevention strategy, cross-service, that's given a strategic leadership by the SAPR office, which has the measurements in there to know whether it's working or not, to give us the granularity to be able to identify trends, to see whether or not it is in fact doing what it's supposed to do. But one of the other recommendations which ties into it is the fact that we don't feel the DoD can do this alone. If we're going to develop a truly effective, comprehensive prevention strategy, we need to partner with our national allies in this effort, with academia, with the national alliances against rape and crimes against women. We need to partner with these experts throughout the country so that we can move forward with a comprehensive prevention strategy ourselves.
Thank you, Ms. Hammond. Thank all of you. I think I'm going to give people an opportunity to just ask another question or two if they have it before we let you all go. And when you talked about culture, Ms. McGinn, I was thinking what we had listened to at the last hearing was about a connection by one of the witnesses, a connection between the ban on women in ground combat and sexual assault. Specifically, that witness testified that the ban sends a signal from the top that women are second-class soldiers and thus inferior to male soldiers. And the inferiority perpetuates an antagonistic view of women that helps create a culture that is conducive to sexual assault. Do you want to reflect on that for us, whether you think that's true or not, and what we might do about it if it is?
I haven't really given that any thought. I do know that, and I think it was in the last task force report on the academies that ISLA can correct me, that the task force noted that at the academies, the percentage of women that you had made a difference in terms of the attitudes and the way that people were treated, that there needed to be kind of a critical mass of women there. I don't know that the ban necessarily creates an issue for us. I hadn't really thought that through.
Can we provide that testimony for you so maybe you'll take a look at it and let us know what you think about it at some point in time? And I don't want to hit you unfairly, but it struck me when you were saying that it tied in on that. Mr. Haidt, you've been very good to sit there throughout this whole hearing. I do want to ask you to weigh in on terms of data collection and where you think we're at on that, what needs to be done to make sure we're at the points we need to be.
Certainly, Mr. Chairman. For any large database like this, it should be viewed as a process. It's a journey that you have to walk down. And so I would say at this juncture that the department is at the end of the beginning of the process. There are some things that have been done. Give them credit for that, but there really is a lot that still remains to be done. And while I'm cautiously optimistic going forward, in part because the department agreed with the recommendations we laid out, which was things that needed to be done going forward, I do have some doubts, and some of those doubts surround what I believe is the need for perhaps more staffing in the program office that's devoted to the acquisition and the implementation of this database, and to make sure that we're not too reliant on contractors to do that work for us.
Thank you very much. Then there's finally the last question I had on this was priorities for the General and the Admiral to address. I think you mentioned one of them, prevention. Is there, amongst the many recommendations that you made to improve the prevention and response program, is there another priority that you think needs attention right away and to a better degree than it's getting now?
We've already discussed the data. We absolutely believe that the database and the tracking for accountability is essential in order to be able to do trend analysis to further address the issue. Without that, I would continue to just kind of chase tails around the table.
Great. Mr. Flake, you any questions?
I'll just yield my time to Mr. Turner. I know he's been working on this a lot.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In looking to the report, General Dunbar, you and I spoke about the issue that there are a number of recommendations in it that are for congressional action. As you know, the National Defense Authorization Act will be moving here in the next couple of months. Jane Harmon and I last year got a number of things that were in it. Obviously, the report, we can peruse through it and pick out those things that are highlighted as congressional action to take action. But I wondered if DOD, in response to the report, had plans on providing us the legislative direction in some of the areas that you're making a suggestion that Congress take action. Is that on your to-do list, or will you be leaving it to us to go through the report and begin to initiate those items?
Congressman Turner, we provided those recommendations to the Department of Defense, and the Secretary of Defense and the military services are looking at that, and they will be providing, Secretary of Defense, I believe on the 1st of March, will be providing the report with his comments. So we will leave it up to the Department of Defense. The task force, for the most part, has concluded its review in providing the report to the Secretary of Defense.
Ms. McGinn, are you aware of whether or not they had some very specific recommendations when we met in my office? I saw the urgency of it and was saying, gosh, we need to get on these. As you know, the bill will be moving in the next couple of months. Are you aware of whether or not I wouldn't want to miss a whole year that DOD has it on its agenda to get those items to us?
If I'm not mistaken, I think in the process right now, we have been working with the military departments, looking at all of the recommendations of the task force and sorting out an overall DOD response because not everybody agrees with everything. So our job is to adjudicate that and make a consolidated position for the Secretary. As we do that, if we see things that need legislative action, we can certainly formulate them for legislative action.
I appreciate your commitment on that because I would, on the ones that you agree with that are in the report, we should move now. Rather than our just taking them and putting them forward and then waiting for a response, it would be great if we could work together on that.
Just to be honest with you, our process might take longer than that. The process, the bureaucratic process in the building, so
well,
we'll
that's the information I needed to know, because if we need to start the process without a DOD, we certainly have the report, and I can get with
Right.
members, including Jane, to see what items that she sees that are important that we might need to move forward.
Thank you. Ms. Hammond, do you have an additional question or two you want?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well,
I assume your committee member?
Ms. Spear, if you're done, that she's next and final here.
Well, if I would,
you got to go
yield
with
to you first. I got to go now.
You have it. Go with it. And then I'll go to Ms. Spear.
Okay. Two things. First, the comment on leadership. I surely agree. I have spoken personally to the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs about speaking out on this issue. We all know that Don't Ask, Don't Tell has gotten a lot of airtime lately. I personally hope we repeal that policy, but they have spoken out on that issue, and I would just use my time to urge them to speak out on this very compelling issue. But here's my question. I understand in the new GAO report you have findings, for example, that say victims don't seek prosecutions for fear of a humiliating public trial, and you also say that half the women who do not report rape or sexual assault do so for fear of retaliation. There are remedies for these things. For example, you could recommend some way to close the trial so it would not be publicly humiliating, or you could recommend that people have an easier time to seek a base transfer in the case of those who worry that they would be retaliated against. That was one of the issues in the Lauterbach problem. Why didn't you make those recommendations?
I think this is the task force report.
I see.
Not to
Okay.
be confused
Excuse
with
me,
the,
I did confuse it
GAO
with yours.
report.
Defense Task Force. You folks in the middle. Why didn't you make those recommendations?
I think, Congresswoman, all the many areas that we looked at, we understood the role of leadership. We understood when we went around and we interviewed all the commanders and especially the courts martial convening authorities in every place, and you saw the extensive list of visitations that we did.
Yeah.
We looked at whether or not they aggressively addressed the issue of sexual assault and how aggressively they prosecuted any sort of concerns that arose within their commands. And the feeling that we got as a task force was that the major majority of commanders and courts martial convening authorities not only take this seriously, but they're out aggressively prosecuting where they can with the advice of counsel. As far as the safety issues, we have specific recommendations for the safety of victims, and we were very, very concerned about the way victims were treated once they reported to their command, and even those that in a restricted way reported to the chaplain or someone else. As the general mentioned, we were very concerned about the safety and security issues. We even went to into the barracks and in the dormitories of the Air Force. We went to see about the security issues that were there, and how were people handled, how were they processed, how were they tended to whenever they reported an incident of sexual assault. So that was part of our focus, a very important part of our focus, and our recommendations, I think, did address some of those issues.
Well, let me just conclude, Mr. Chairman, that I think the rate of prosecutions lags way behind civil society, and I think there's much more to do, and part of it is a training issue for prosecutors. And again, I think the Army offers the best example for what needs to be done there. And on the safety issue, there are some specific recommendations that I think could have been in your report and weren't. For example, facilitating base transfer, which would encourage a lot of women to come forward who would otherwise be afraid to do so. And if they did so, in the case of Lauterbach, would have a horrible outcome. So I think there's more to do, and I think it needs to focus around prevention much more than just response, and we would get a lot farther, a lot faster with this epidemic among those who step forward to protect our country and who, in fact, we don't protect well enough. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity
Thank you, Ms.
to be
Harmon.
here.
We appreciate your interest and concern. The gentlewoman from California, Ms. Spear, we thank you for your interest and for your leadership on this issue. We're happy you could join us here today. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A question to the task force. My understanding is that in 2008 there were 2,265 unrestricted reports that were filed. Of those reports, how many of them then were pursued as full criminal investigations and court-martialed?
Congresswoman, I believe that actually the SAPRO office is better suited because they have the data for that to answer the question.
Right.
I think we have the report for this.
I just want to make sure, as being a representative in San Diego, where the tragedy finally opened up this book, caused
And
not
if
only Toyota, but the American...
there were 2,389 investigations on reports made in this and prior years, and we collect data by fiscal year, but certainly if an assault occurs in September, for example, that case is not may not be completed by then. But there were 2,763 subjects. 592 were pending disposition. 136 subjects were civilians or foreign nationals not subject to the UCMJ, so the commander couldn't take action. There were 129 subjects that were unidentified. There were 1,074 subjects that had cases that were unsubstantiated, unfounded, lacked sufficient evidence, or involved a victim that recanted or a subject that died. There were 1,339 subjects that were referred by commanders for the following actions. There were 317 referred for courts-martial, 247 for non-judicial punishments, and 268 administrative actions or discharges.
All right. If I understand this correctly, over half of the cases, or just about half of the cases, were not dealt with. You said 1,074 because of lack of evidence or recanting or the like. So half of those people who had the guts to come forward were dismissed for whatever reasons, correct? And then of the remaining, you have 317 that were court-martials of that original 2,300 figure, and 247 that had some kind of administrative action taken. So I'm in the service. I know those figures. What's the likelihood of me reporting a second time when of those who had the guts to report end up seeing that half of them are thrown out? Now, I don't know the circumstances under when they were or how they were thrown out, but those numbers are chilling. And if, in fact, there are so many more that go unreported for the very reason that they're concerned about ostracism or retaliation, we've got a bigger problem than one might suspect.
Well, there's another point that we have 6 different categories of sexual assault in the UCMJ, from the least egregious, which would be indecent touching, to aggravated assault or rape. So there's a wide variety of sexual assaults. It's not just rape. But what you were talking about...
With all due respect, unwelcome touching, to me, is an assault. And I think for most women, it would be an assault. So to somehow diminish them because there are levels of gravity is not really comforting.
And, well, the commander does have the discretion to award a punishment that he feels fits the crime, if you will. And we do provide synopses in our annual report, which describes each of these cases. And I don't think you will get any of us disagreeing with you. And we know we can do better. And just as Ms. Harmon said, part of her interest and her relationship with the former Secretary of the Army, we are looking closer at how to train trial counsel. And we actually just got the funding to train prosecutors and investigators so that we can improve the process. But I wanted to comment on something. You used the word chilling, and there is something in the literature called the chilling effect. And if you do send a case to courts-martial and that person gets off, by the time it gets back to the people in the unit or the people in the academy, they think usually the perception is the victim lied, or and it has a tremendous effect when that happens.
So I would suggest a couple things. One is there's got to be a way to videotape a victim and change their voice so that they aren't necessarily specifically identifiable. 2, I think that there should be a zero tolerance policy that is communicated everywhere, and then is reflected in what actually takes place. And 3rd, I think there should be some kind of a review of those women who come forward and who make a complaint. There is a court-martial. The individual perpetrator is court-martialed. What then happens to the victim in their professional career? I'd like to see us track them to see what is their life like afterwards. Because if their life is, for all intents and purposes, professionally destroyed, that sends us yet another message of why we're not getting people coming forward. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. That concludes our questioning of this panel. I just want to take one moment to thank our friends from the General Accountability Office. You've been steadfast and incredibly helpful on this, and I suspect your work isn't done. At some point, we may want you to sort of look at this again for us or whatever, but I just want to thank you for the great work that you've done. Dr. Iasello and General Dunbar, thank you for your service generally to the country or whatever, but for specifically on this task force. I understand from your testimony that you think you're done now, and is that complete? You're complete your responsibilities on this. so I'm sure that you're on to other things or whatever, but we appreciate a great deal of the work that you did. We understand the magnitude of it, the time and effort that went into it, and the specificity in your report is incredibly helpful, and I really believe that it's going to be looked at and used as a guide to folks going forward. So thank both of you as well. And Dr. Whitley and Ms. McGinn, when this whole series of hearings started, we weren't too favorably disposed towards the department's attitude toward this, and that's nothing personal against Dr. Whitley, because I think she had her work impeded. Mr. Rodriguez and others, I think, were horrible, and I think they did things that they shouldn't have done. I think their attitude wasn't where it should be on this issue. I am impressed with both of you, with a sense of responsibility and desire to deal with this. I think we have ways to go, and I think your acknowledgement of that is comforting to us, that you understand exactly what's going on here and that there's work to do, and you seem quite willing to do it and to use the good resources that you've had at your disposal to get it done. I think I can speak for the rest of the committee on this. We appreciate that. It has not always been the case. It gives us a feeling that as we go forward, we don't have to have hearing after hearing after hearing to see whether or not the Department of Defense takes us seriously on that. So good luck going forward on that. Thank you, everybody, for your work on that. I hope that the men and women in the service are somewhat comforted by the fact that you're on it, you're on the case, and you're working on it, and as a group, we'll all take this as a joint challenge and move forward. Thank you very much. At this point in time, I want to thank the witnesses on this panel, and we'll now receive testimony from our second panel before us, Mr. Merle Wilberding. Thank you.
Okay, I'll stay.
Thank you, folks, for allowing Mr. Wilberding to take his seat. General. Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Wilberding. Thank you very much for being here. Mr. Merle Wilberding is an attorney with the law firm of Coolidge Wall in Dayton, Ohio. He represented Mary Louderback after the death of her daughter, Lance Corporal Maria Louderback. He has previously worked with a number of additional families of victims of military sexual assault. He is also a retired captain in the United States Army, where he served in the Judge Advocate General Corps. Mr. Wilberding brings holds a JD from the University of Notre Dame. So I want to thank you, Mr. Wilberding, for coming here, making your time to make yourself available for us and help us. I ask that you please stand. Just raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do. Thank you very much. With that, Mr. Wilberding, you have a statement, I understand. Your full statement will be put on the record, of course. But if you could tell us in 5 minutes generally your points, your high points on that, we'd appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Tierney, Congressman Flake, and members of the panel. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today. I have submitted my written statement, and I'll give you a short summary right now. I'm Merle Wilberding. I'm an attorney from Dayton, Ohio. During the Vietnam War, I served as a captain in the Army Judge Advocate General's Corps. Since early January of 2008, I have represented Mary Louderback, the mother of Marine Lance Corporal Maria Louderback, who had filed a claim of sexual assault against fellow Marine Corporal Cesar Lorien, only to be murdered 6 months later and buried in a shallow fire pit in Cesar Lorien's backyard. At a hearing before this subcommittee on July 31, 2008, Mary Louderback became the voice of her daughter as she shared the fears and harassment that Maria had endured after she had filed the sexual assault complaint. This afternoon, I want to talk about the continuing stream of other victims and their families who have reached out to Mary and me. For me, it started in the cemetery after Maria's funeral. I was approached by 3 or 4 women, all of whom told me that they had been victims of sexual assault in the military, and all of whom told me that their lives had never recovered. As time continued, the stories from other victims continued. In February, we had a call from a mother whose daughter had filed a sexual assault claim against a fellow soldier. My heart went out to her as she said, "Maria's story could have been my daughter's story. The only difference between my daughter and Maria Lauterbach is that Maria is dead." In March, we had another call from a mother whose 19-year-old daughter had filed a sexual assault claim against a fellow soldier. Instead of receiving protection and programs to help her recover, she was haunted by the ostracism and disbelief of the fellow members of the unit. Meanwhile, the accused was treated with sympathy and deference as the case moved forward. In June, after the NBC Dateline aired a program on Maria Lauterbach's case, we received a telephone call from a mother who had watched the program. Her 20-year-old daughter was a Marine who had just made a sexual assault claim. Now she feared for her life. She had a military victim advocate assigned to her, but the victim advocate told her that there wasn't really anything she could do for her. All of these stories were virtually identical. The complaining victim became isolated and harassed. Their lives were disoriented. The victim became the accused became the victim. Significantly, all of these victims were no longer effectively contributing to the mission of the military. I want to focus on victim advocates, or as I often call them, victim listeners. In every discussion I have had with victims and victims' families, the victim advocate was described as a very nice person who expressed her concern and understanding, but was not proactive and was not independent, and either could not or was not able to do anything. In Maria Lauterbach's case, her victim advocate was her direct report within the chain of command. Consequently, her victim advocate had to think about her own efficiency reports, her own performance reviews, and her own obligations to the command. I have read the report of the Defense Task Force on Sexual Assault in the Military Services. There are recommendations to improve the victim advocate program, but I do not believe they go far enough. Victim advocates need the ability and the training to be more proactive. It is at these most critical times that the victim advocate must act. It is important to remember that these victims are often 18 to 21 years old, and at this point, very vulnerable, very much alone, and very much incapable of making good decisions. Victim advocates need clear authority to act independent of the command. Congress should consider establishing a line of authority for victim advocates that is outside the base chain of command. Are we making progress? I'm at the boots of the ground level. What I see is not progress. I've heard the testimony of the panel before and the difficulties of making progress and of measuring progress, and I accept their testimony for what it was. But I do not think we've done enough. We need to do more. Victims need a better protection system to survive sexual assaults in the military, and the military needs a better victim protection system to protect their own interest in continuing to have a supportive and healthy and active military force. And thank you, and I'm open for any questions you have.
Thank you, sir. We appreciate that. Why don't we start the question with Mr. Turner, who was kind enough to make sure that your testimony was procured for us here today. Mr. Turner?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you again, and also the Ranking Member Flake, for allowing Mr. Wilberding to testify. In addition to his work, obviously his perspective is, with the Lauterbach family, his perspective is very helpful to us as he has reviewed the report that we had just received. I'd like to ask you, if I could, to enter into the record an op-ed piece that Mr. Wilberding has written, Sexual Assault in the Military, Looking for a Few Good Changes, that has some of the recommendations that he had just...
Without objection, so ordered.
And I wanted to ask Mr. Wilberding, when you began to represent the Lauterbach family and the facts began to unfold, you had a critical eye and ability to look at where things went wrong, where the military and DOD did things wrong. And I've greatly appreciated that, because it's been a great assistance to me as we've looked to legislation that might be able to address some of the issues. But one thing I find really compelling about the story of your experience since you began working with the Lauterbach family is that others have come to you. And they've come to you with their stories of their experience. Why do you think people are reaching out so and have been contacting you to tell you their stories also?
Well, it's been an interesting process in the time period now, really 2 years from that. And people have called from all over the country. The cases I cited here, they were in military bases throughout the country. And each time what was consistent to me was that they had nowhere to turn to. They had their daughters in every case did not have any faith and trust in the victim advocate that they were dealing with. They didn't have any faith in the superiors dealing with. They were really struggling, and these are, for the most part, hard-working people who didn't have the money to go to the faraway places. In every instance, as their daughter was a very long distance from home. So there wasn't the support system for the daughter from the home that you could have. For example, if a rape occurred in a college atmosphere, there are a lot of other ones. But in the military, it's different. And I think they were reaching out to us primarily because, one, they wanted to tell their story. I thought they really wanted to get the story out of the struggles and frustrations they had. And two, I think they were looking for a support group to have them reassure that people cared about them. Because I thought that was what I really felt, is that they were so alone. Their daughters were so alone, and they were getting no support from anyone in the military. And that's what they were reaching out for.
Well, your recommendation on the victim advocates in taking them from the chain of command, how will that allow them to be more proactive, and what would that do to help us in this system?
Well, it's an interesting concept, and especially in the light of the conversation from the panel earlier today. My initial thought had always been that when the Marines issued their statement on January 15th of 2008, remember that her body was found on Friday, January 11th, and at 3 o'clock the Marines issued a 9-page opening statement, they called it, that listed everything they had done. And what struck me about it, and by the way, they read it to us, I was in a conference room with Mary Lauterbach, they read it to us literally minutes before they walked in front and read it. So we had no opportunity to see it in advance, and we're trying to take notes on it. But what struck me about that 9-page opening statement was it was a series of statements as to providing some basis for why they didn't do what they didn't take things seriously, didn't take certain actions, didn't pursue her. Everything seemed to us that it looked like they were given reasons why they didn't do anything, and why their guesses at that were reasonable guesses. And what struck me is there wasn't anything in there, gee whiz, we could have done more, we should have done more. It came across with not a mea culpa, but a Maria culpa. It really struck me as they were saying, well, nobody gave us all the hard evidence if you had just told me all that. And they're putting the burden on the accused to connect the dots, and there were a lot of red alerts in that. And what struck me about the conference and the panel earlier was that when the question was asked, why wasn't it in the report, and the response was they talked to the commanders, and I have a good appreciation for that, and a good amount of respect for them, great respect for them. When you talk to the commanders, it's like the same situation. To my reaction is the same as what I saw here. And it's the same as people in general. When people look at facts, they tend to look at it as reinforcing their own position. When institutions look at facts, they tend to look at the facts reinforcing their own position. So when the Marines looked at the Lauterbach facts, they looked at it in the sense of, well, we did this, we did that, nobody told us about this, nobody told us about that. And that's what I heard, frankly, in my view of the commanding generals. Do we need an independent one? No, we're doing a good job ourselves. And I sort of sense that that's how that's in part human nature and part institutional nature, but I think it's something to keep in mind as you evaluate those positions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Orbiting.
Thank you. Well, where would the line of authority lie to best ensure that independence?
Well, that's a fair question, and a reasonable opportunity as to whether or not there's, I recognize the suggestion that it should be a DOD employee if it's a civilian or a member of the military if it's a military victim advocate. But I think if they talk about it, and I've been out of the Army for a number of years, but the Defense Council and the military have a separate chain of command that the prosecutors don't have, and they did that to create some independence in that. And in terms of that, why I think it's important, and Maria's case is a good illustration, is the Marines gave their statement on January 15th, said this is what happened, every fact is true, and nobody told us differently, and we obviously don't have any obligation to pursue it. But in doing that, they didn't really look at what had happened beforehand, and consequently things just fell by the wayside, and they didn't have a independent victim advocate saying, particularly in that period, which should have been all the time, from May until December. She went missing on December 14th. The victim advocate could have been and should have been doing more things. But from December 14th to January 11th, to me, that's where an independent advocate could have been most helpful. You know, what about this evidence? Mary Lauterbach, as the mother, could have been in contact with her. Found this, found that. Why don't you do more?
Yeah, I guess I get that aspect of it. I think it's a point well made. But to whom would that victim advocate report?
I think they would have to create that system within the military.
And what about the task force recommendation that there would be privileged communications between the advocate and the victim? Is that a good idea?
I think that's a very good recommendation. I read the victim stories in Appendix F and detailed the stories where defense counsel for the accused had essentially taken the depositions, called them as trial. I think that's a very good suggestion.
Mr. Flake? Mr. Turner? Sir, I want to thank you for coming all the way to make your suggestions. I appreciate you letting us put your article on the record. I think these are things that will help inform our decisions as we go forward, and particularly with that one idea that certainly needs and warrants to be explored. So our appreciation. Thank you. With that, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
For your testimony.